all the element called
It's a fun crossover world to be in if you're lucky enough to access it, but you do need that classical pedigree, that training to be able to do that. I know that for sure. And so that's why I continue to practice classical music daily. The sound world that I draw from is really a classical one in terms of how I hear the instrument when I play. I think you have to go beyond the notes in that we talk about expression and phrasing. And in classical music, I think, well, if you go to a classical conservatory and you ask some of the top players there what they're working on, they'll tell you intonation, they'll tell you rhythm, they'll tell you phrasing, they'll tell you dynamics. And as an improviser, I deal with all of those things all the time. So already you're dealing in parallel worlds. The difference obviously being that maybe the classical concert, the notes are dictated. At the jazz one, we're free to interpret or make them up. But I think the word to focus on is interpret, because in many ways a classical musician has to interpret what's on the page and communicate that to the audience. That's the skill of being a great classical musician, I think, is lifting the notes and being able to improvise with them in your expression, in your control of dynamics, in your control of phrasing, breath, resonance. All of these things, you're improvising in many ways. Your ear is doing the work. You're always aware of your surroundings and adjusting accordingly. In jazz, well, we do just the same thing. Of course, yes, the notes are not written, so we have this ability to be able to make things up. But we're interpreting melody. It's just the same thing. We may have more liberty in terms of, displacing things, but I think the skill is very much the same. And I think it's an exciting thing to really dial into that, particularly with the classical musicians. I'm lucky enough to have a few classical string players who I work with regularly. And we work a lot on this, taking a classical melody that they're working on and trying to relate a lot of the work and the skill that they do to communicate that music to interpreting a jazz melody, because it's extraordinary how the two basically cross over almost entirely. And when you can get somebody into that mindset, in some ways you've broken open the door. And then it's just obviously listening to more jazz and listening to improv and working on ideas and other things to try and get them to explore making something up. That's our job, I think, is to contribute to a melody, whether it be your own or somebody else's. And I think that would be just the same if Tchaikovsky was sitting in the audience and I was to get up and play his concerto. He'd want to hear my interpretation of his music. And I'm sure there would be many liberties he'd be willing to allow me to take.